And welcome to our final lecture of the UVA Summer Design Institute lecture series. Tonight, I'd like to begin with a recognition that the University of Virginia is located on the land of the Monacan people. We give our honor and respect. We also acknowledge the enslaved laborers that built the grounds and architecture and contribute to the spaces we occupy today. I'm extremely pleased to introduce tonight's lecturer, Kristis Cheramie. Kristis Project is Associate Professor and Head of Landscape Architecture at the Knowlton School. Her research explores the many ways we use building to respond to and cope with environmental fluctuation. Using speculation as a tool to reconstruct the historical systems, scales, and materials that give rise to adaptability and transformation in the landscape, her work reveals interconnections between story, memory, ground, and time. Her first book, Through Time and the City, Notes on Rome, was released this past year from Rutledge. In 2016 and 17, Kristi received the Rome Prize in Landscape Architecture from the American Academy in Rome, where she examined early modern notions of environmentalism and perceptions of flooding, climate exigencies, and debris. Running parallel to her projects in Rome, Kristi also works on the implications of early 20th century flood control infrastructure in the lower Mississippi River Basin. In addition to writing, her visual work has been exhibited throughout the US. Her work on Louisiana coastal communities comprised by land loss, sea level rise, and competing industrial interests has been supported by the Van Allen Institute and the National Endowment for the Arts. Kristi holds a Bachelor of Science in Architecture from the University of Virginia and a Master of Architecture from the University of California, Berkeley. And before joining the Knowlton School, she taught at Louisiana State University, where Kristi and I worked together and became really good friends. Her talk tonight is titled Nutritious Dust. Please welcome Kristis Cheramie.
Hi, everybody. It's great to see you. Thanks, Brad, for the introduction. I have never done a summer lecture series, and it's a remarkably humane way to think about putting a lecture together. And so thanks for all of you for joining me here tonight. Let's see, I'm gonna go ahead and share screen. And Brad, just let me know if we are off track at any point.
Okay, yep, all is good.
Great. So nice introduction. Thanks, Brad. I appreciate that. As Brad said, I work on landscape change, and in particular, I'm interested in working on how environmental dynamics leave physical, behavioral, and perceptual traces behind for those beings that are living in and passing through landscapes. These are what I often talk about as landscape consequences. So tonight I'm going to take you through, I'm not really going to go into any one project in much depth, but instead I'm going to try to focus on how I make work and how that and how different types of making function in different points in a project. So if you have questions about specific projects, I'm happy to take that in the Q&A or talk to you after the fact. So we'll start with beginnings, the landscapes that sort of pique my interest. So I tend to gravitate towards those places that are in obvious states of change, places that are exhibiting extreme moments of decay or extreme moments of growth, places that are seemingly silent or quiet, empty or still, places where the negotiations with forces of change have in some way failed. So here we're looking at South Louisiana, just a couple of days after a hurricane has blown through. And then finally, places where the traces of those negotiations are substantial enough that they push the landscape into an entirely new state. So this is a photograph of Lake Maurepas, which is just north of New Orleans, of South Central Louisiana. And historically, this was a thriving cypress tupelo swamp that was aggressively logged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And what remains today is not a cypress tupelo swamp in principle, but the traces of it having been a cypress tupelo swamp. So the long lines you see are the canals that were cut to extract the felled timber. So what I've shown you so far are photographs, and I use photography quite a lot, but for me, I'm not speaking about photography as a whole, but as it functions within my work, it's primarily a tool of documentation. And I would say a sort of neutral beginning that's very much about gathering. Drawing, on the other hand, is a process of transformation that runs throughout my work, and I use it in a variety of different ways. Drawing for me is a way of stepping away from the obligations of reportage and instead figuring out ways to free up what I describe as the nutritious dust in a place. So sort of like blurring your eyes and just seeing what comes through when it starts to get hazy. That for me is a moment of transformation, when it's less about recording what I'm seeing and more about pulling things, harvesting information that I can then use through a series of sort of recombinatory operations, which is to say design. So I'm going to do something I've never done before in a lecture. Slightly scary. I'm going to show you a handful of drawings that I have run through my work going all the way back to when I was a student. And these are not externally facing drawings for me. These are internal drawings that I use as part of my process at different points along the way. They basically provide a framework for me to think through the various elements of a project. Yeah, here we go. I'm going to show you stuff that I don't normally show people. The first is a series called the Spatial Incantations. And I started this drawing series in about 2003 as a result of a mildly traumatic desk crit with my studio critic, my fourth year studio critic at the time at UVA, a person for whom I hold a great deal of respect, and I'm very grateful for this conversation. Sande Iliescu came to my desk. I brought out my drawings. I showed them to her. And I was pretty excited about them. She said, Kristi, why are you drawing so normal? You need to stop trying to draw normal. And it took a while for this to really take hold for me and for me to figure out what this meant in terms of my own work. But my takeaway from that was that she was completely correct. I was trying to mimic aesthetics. And I was trying to use drawing. I had become quite good at that point at matching drawings that I liked, that I was seeing that my classmates were putting up in reviews, or that at that time I was seeing in magazines, and skipping past drawing as a method and going right to drawing as a finished aesthetic. So the spatial incantations is what resulted from that process. And this is what sketching looks like for me. For me, sketching is not ever about sketching in the likeness of or sketching image of, but instead trying to think about it as a harvesting process. So again, these aren't meant for you to necessarily see anything that's recognizable in them, but they are my kind of seed collection process that I use continuously. So I've got dozens and dozens of sketchbooks, thousands of these drawings, most of which stay confined to the sketchbook, but certain seeds take hold, right, and start to germinate ideas for you. And in those cases, I scan them. What you're looking at here is scanned drawings that have been worked on digitally, printed, and then reworked by hand. These are sketchbook drawings that have been scanned and worked on digitally. So this is a sort of go-to method for me that's all about practicing the craft of dissociative visualizing and learning to, or retaining the muscle memory that's about stepping away from kind of constant analysis. On the flip side of that is this series that I've always called the growth series. And this emerged from an obsession of mine from a very early age in stop motion animation and flip books. And in terms of landscape tools or tools of landscape representation and landscape exploration, I think there's a lot to be gleaned from the stop motion process, where we're not just thinking about the before and after, but giving primacy to the cells that happen in between and figuring out where different breakpoints are, whether that's a tipping point or a moment of exchange from one state to another. So here you're looking at a farm right outside of Bakersfield, California, over the course of one growing cycle. As that translates into more polished work or more finished work, this is a competition entry from a few years back, and it was a one board competition entry. In the plan view for this project, we rendered at the 100-year mark, but the brief asked us to think about the project in the context of much longer spans of time. And so simply rendering one moment sort of failed to capture, while we were able to show a lot of detail in the actual plan, it failed to capture the way that we imagine the project functioning over a long period, in this case, a totally realistic 10,000 years. So the growth series allows, which is super simple, just a sort of breakdown of how this project evolves, grows, and then decays. In this case, a giant salt crystal that seeds the earth for poisonous oleander as a warning signal. The last series is called Landscape Totems. Pretty early on in my work, I figured out that collaborations were going to be, and interdisciplinary collaborations were going to be a kind of guiding light for me. And I very rarely work exclusively by myself. And I've had the good fortune of frequently working with historians that specialize in ethnography. And so oral histories have become part of the regular data collection in a lot of the projects that I've worked on. Early on in the course of those projects, one of the jobs that fell to me was to try and visualize those oral histories. I approached it first as a process of trying to sort through the oral history in search of things that felt factual and felt real or verifiable, things that I could cross-reference to USGS maps, for example, or historical archives. And the results of those were deeply unsatisfying and sort of empty, I think would be a good way of describing it. And in going back to the drawing board and trying to work through this in a different way, what this drawing series is about is drawing landscape memory. And so what gets left out of the drawing is exactly as important as that which is vibrant enough to provide a framework and land on the page. And I think we know enough about our own memories to know that memory can be vivid and detailed and highly specific, but not necessarily accurate. And so what you're seeing here is a sort of recombination of descriptions of landscapes that don't hold an obligation to being measured or accurate, but they're drawn in such a way to pay homage to or be respectful of the sort of vibrancy of any given memory. Okay, so I'm gonna switch gears a little bit and talk about the word representation. This is a word, I've struggled with this word ever since I got into design. And it's a word that I've gone back and forth with, really wrestled with. I'm fairly certain I've had some pretty heated arguments. Let's call them respectful debates with Brad Cantrell back in the time machine. About what is representation, what does it mean, and what kind of traps do we fall into when we use that word? And so I want to try to talk around this as I've worked with it. And the disclaimer I'll say is it's a word that I still struggle with, and would be interested to hear your thoughts on when we're done with this. The etymology of the word is not that difficult to get to the bottom of. It's French and Latin, and it means to show, to exhibit, or to display. And that is part of what we do as designers, right? We show things to clients, we exhibit things for communities, we display things for contractors. But the word embeds the drawing process. Representation as a word embeds the drawing process with a monodirectional attitude, wherein the designer is the keeper of knowledge that is then shown to an unknowing audience. And that's where I think we start to get into a little bit of trouble. There's nothing inherently wrong with doing that, right? There are times when that's perfectly appropriate. You're looking at, here is another competition entry wherein we were speaking to a jury, by way of our competition boards. And the job, the mandate of the competition was to be able to explain not only that we had a vision for a design proposal, but we understood the tectonics of how it would come together, and we had a plan for an assembly process, right? And the drawings needed to communicate a kind of certitude and confidence about how that process would unfold. So not necessarily bad, but representation as a word that encapsulates all the things that we make as designers, I think is on the kind of nice end of it is limiting, right? It's not the only thing that we do. I'll talk about that more in a bit. On the more severe end, I would say that representation as a word is also dangerous. It is inherently about explication or explaining and didactics. And that suggests that the designer has been in a power position to be the keeper of knowledge. This has historically problematic power dynamics in terms of how the things we put forward move out into the world and how we imagine that information moves back and forth in a design project. So that being said, I wrote this book called Through Time in the City. And we get into book writing projects for all kinds of reasons. And I won't go into the ones that are related to why I decided to write a book about Rome, why it took me so long. Instead, I'll focus on one of the reasons why I wrote this book was to try and push representation as a method within my own work, away from the idea that the designer is the keeper of knowledge, into a place where the designer is a translator, a connector, and a cross-referencer. And to use the book as a way of exploring what that would look like. So this is the table of the contents for the book. And again, I'm not going to go into much detail about the book, but except to say that each chapter moves stratigraphically through the city of Rome, from geology to climate, from ritual patterns of use to the relationship between construction materials and Roman identity. The job that I gave the book was to try to mediate the overwhelming amount of Rome-centric scholarship and be a singular place that pulls together the expertise of a wide range of disciplines and a wide range of different types of information. So the book is roughly 50% text, 50% visual information, all of which is coded and cross-referenced throughout the book. Some of the drawings are straightforward mappings. And there we go. Some of the drawings are straightforward mappings of systems and conditions in the city. And others are more spatialized diagrams that aggregate a wide range of data types to visualize behaviors and trajectories that describe how the city has changed over a pretty long period of time. So I'm going to show you a few, just kind of click through without giving a ton of explanation, a few examples from chapter 4, which explores climate, the relationship between climate and public health in Rome. And the complicated notions around miasma that got attached to certain ecologies in such a way that, and the residents of those landscapes, and produced prejudice that still persists to this day. So the book draws together, here we're looking at about 5 or 6 different disciplines that their data sets that would normally stay trapped in different scientific journals, and tries to pull them together around a story about how climate is very much interwoven in exploitation of the land and pushing climate or driving climate into periods of crisis. So there's still a host of scenarios that can't be worked on through representation alone. And I think it would have made for an interesting lecture. I'll leave this to someone else to take on that wide range of scenarios or situations that we as designers are called to step into, where representation doesn't make the cut. and try to put them into a kind of taxonomy or classification system so that we can understand the range. I didn't do that today, but I'm going to simplify that by saying that what I'm interested in kind of digging into next are landscape mysteries. The situations in which representation alone can never get the job done, right? When representation as a method can't solve or can't surface any of the scenario, any of the kind of complexity around a true landscape mystery. Because the stories are too complex, because the spaces are too highly manipulated, or because the data over time has become too obscured that you can't ever quite get a clear sense of any hard data points. So this requires the designer, or more than just the designer, knowing stuff and then speaking that back to a community or to an audience. Instead, it requires an approach to making that is inherently co-constructive, right? Where the designer is actually part of the intermediate moment that allows information to flow in multiple directions. An example of that, a couple of examples of landscape mysteries here. This is a community in South Louisiana called Ravenswood, predominantly Black community. This map is USGS from 1940. And just after this map was released, the Army Corps of Engineers stepped in and redesignated this area to become part of a large-scale flood control infrastructure project known as the Morganza Floodway. The results of that project created a landscape that looks like this. This is an updated USGS map. You can see that the topography is relatively the same, but radical changes to what this place is and how this place functions for any number of beings associated with this place. Another example of this one in Rome, what you're looking at here is what's commonly known, probably most familiarly known as the Roman Forum. But when this etching was made in 1873, this area was known as the Campo Vaccino, or the cow pasture. Over the course of the late medieval period and into the early modern period, what was originally and is now known as the Roman Forum had accumulated a huge amount of debris through flooding and abandonment, and had essentially covered over the Roman Forum. In the 1870s, when Benziger made this etching, there are two converging forces that land in Rome and cause quite a bit of change. The first is the emergence of the discipline of archaeology, and the second is the rise of the Italian state. So the two got together and essentially decided that moving backwards to reclaim the imperial legacies of Rome would be a great project for the archaeologists and helpful to the state. And so enormous swaths of the city, the medieval city, were quite simply just systematically removed and discarded, not documented and erased. So here you see three views of the Colosseum with the ground level dropping, and the emergent ecologies on the inside gradually disappearing. So in short, representation alone in scenarios like this just is simply not robust enough to take on these types of conundrums. And so we have to come up with other ways of digging in and working with landscapes like this. For me, this is about thinking about the things that we make, whether that's a drawing or building a robot, or I don't care what, anything that we make as designers. If we think about it as an instrument, a device, or a tool, it really changes our relationship to what we make and how that moves out into the design process and into the world. It's not about showing, right? If representation is about showing an idea, the instrument becomes about operating. That inherently and immediately becomes multidirectional, multisensory, and hybrid. And I would argue that that is a more democratic and flatter in approach to making in terms of power dynamics. I got a chance to sit in on part of the Smout Allen lecture, and they brought up flight simulators. I also share a love of flight simulators, especially the really bad ones from the early days. Not just because they're bad, but because the kind of feedback loop that it creates, kind of landscape feedback loops, are amazing. So my interest here is not just in the data that's produced in the simulator, or the user experience of the simulator, but the ways in which these become conflated and notions of knowledge creation and knowledge flow really does change quite a bit. So both the person deploying the simulation and the person who is immersed in the experience of the simulation both get wrapped up in both the real world and the simulated world. So we have two worlds, two scales, two times, all unfolding simultaneously. And that is a very right place for a designer to be thinking about working. Also part of this equation, so from flight simulators to dioramas, which I would put in the same category, another part of this for me goes back to aesthetics. One of the things I like about thinking of the things that we make as devices or instruments is that it gets past the question of aesthetics, or at least aesthetics are no longer the end goal. In cases like this, the aesthetic of the device is only as important as its capacity to enable its users to step into other places and other times and other possibilities. So this enables us to let go, us as designers, to let go of what the work looks like and instead focus on how it behaves and how its behavior I think it frees us up incredibly as designers and releases us to be far more experimental and wide-ranging. Filmmakers have known this, I think, for a long time and have been pretty amazing at warping scale and hybridizing worlds just enough, with just enough markers of realness to suspend disbelief. I saw some familiar faces on Zoom early on, so I'm going to go back to a familiar favorite. This is also like seeing an old colleague. The Mississippi River Basin model is one of, I think, probably my favorite all-time greatest and most flawed examples of tools that I've ever come across. And I'm not going to go into much depth about this today. Mark and Laura mentioned it in their talk as well, but suffice it to say, this is a 200-acre hydraulic model built in the 40s and that functioned for the Army Corps of Engineers through 1970s. And it is a giant space that simulates 33% of the United States, so the Mississippi River Basin. Once it was built and calibrated, which took about 5 years, the model became a kind of destination and proving ground for moving through time. So in addition to the Army Corps of Engineers that would work on different simulations and test things, they also brought in stakeholders and decision makers to the model and set them out at the spaces that were most familiar to them. And they used historical floods that these stakeholders had actually lived through in order to simulate what could happen in the future. So we see them standing in real space, like real time, simulation of historical conditions in order to project different decision possibilities moving forward. And so I think that's an incredibly flexible, if super weird, and I'm not gonna get into all the flaws, and there are definitely flaws, but pretty amazing conflation of time and space all in one piece of, in one giant space of instrumentation. Am I doing on time here? Okay. So I considered a few ways of concluding this lecture and had planned to show a project that's currently underway that explores digital drawing and milling processes for copper plate intaglio etchings, all around the topic of monumental removal of contested markers in the public realm. And I'm really excited about that project, but I'm going to ask that I'm not going to show it to you today. Sorry. Just check back with me in October when the exhibition opens, and I'll pick up where we left off. I think in the end, although it has, I think a lot of it's related to this conversation about how we use representation. I think the content of the work is loaded in a direction that's more than I wanted to get into today. And I also, given that you are, most of you are starting your graduate studies or starting your career in design, I wanted to end with a cautionary tale about representation. Which also makes me feel a little bit nervous. So I'm going to talk to you today about a project that I completed while I was at the American Academy. And this is to tell you that the choice about working with drawing or working with making as a tool of representation versus a tool that moves beyond representation is not as simple as a decision that's made at the very beginning of a process, but it's something that you have to be accountable for continuously, even as the work begins to move out. Brad mentioned, I think, in the introduction that my project was looking at the lost histories of the Colosseum, the sort of late medieval and early modern period in the Colosseum, in which it was an incredibly vibrant and active place in the city. But the vibrancy and the activity that was taking hold was not valued by a city resurgent, and so it was systematically erased. My project during that time was to I primarily worked with a historian, an early modernist, Rob Kleins, but we had a number of different consultants from a range of disciplines, but began by pulling together a data-rich story about climate, particularly in the Little Ice Age, but looking at broad trajectories across Italy and how those landed in Rome, and even more specifically at the Colosseum, where which is actually sits in a very interesting climate spot in the city. The project was to take all of this data and produce a series of visualizations that could do two things. One, first and foremost, act as a critique to archaeological reconstructions, which I consider to be vaguely horrifying. If any of you have a background in archaeology, please don't take offense, but they're incredibly cartoonish and reductive representations of what life might have been like at any point in time. And I think underserved in terms of their role in helping put the science of archaeology into a larger story. So we wanted to offer an alternative to the traditional approach to reconstructive drawings. But we also wanted to use these visualizations as a tool to pull together a wide range of disciplines around moments in time where no one's quite sure what happened, and use the visualizations as basically a table to compare notes. We started with trying to understand essentially how water moved through this part of the city as a result of excessive flooding in the Little Ice Age. And we started by going back to 1349, right at the end, in the aftermath of a major earthquake in the city. And tried to step back into the Colosseum, a Colosseum recently racked by earthquakes. And then to think through the ways in which the upper portions of the Colosseum would have been occupied or converted into housing. The interior drainage system of the Colosseum functioned until about the 14th century. Functioned used loosely, but by the 14th century, it really shut down. And that coincided with temperature dropping and flooding increasing in Rome. And this is a climate period that's where Rome and the Mediterranean don't get quite as much attention as some of the other parts of the world, where the experience of the Little Ice Age was much more extreme. But the microclimate of the Colosseum was in fact extreme, And the way that this building functioned during this time radically changed very quickly. By the 16th century, quarrying became well documented, and we have tons of papal bulls describing all of the permissions that were given to various stakeholders across the city, papal bulls being the kind of early modern equivalent to city permits to remove material from the city. So we know about quantities, and we know even to some extent about whether it was marble or travertine or tufa, but we don't. What isn't harder to get to the bottom of is the kind of effect of this much material being removed and piled and this much debris sitting around the city. So the intention of these pieces, the first life of these pieces, was as a tool. These were constructed as really large drawings, 20 feet wide, 15 feet tall, meant to be immersive. And meant to be a platform for scholars to easily step into and accept the potential reality of this, and use that to debate the possibility from their level of from their expertise. So bring their data to bear and use that to trade notes and compare data. And it worked really well for that. So as long as we were going to symposia and going to conferences and bringing scholars together, the tool worked. But after I left the academy, I started getting invitations to exhibit these drawings, which was fantastic, and I appreciate those opportunities. But the afterlife of these drawings immediately turned them into representation. They became divorced or decoupled from the discussions of the data. They became separated from the notion that they were in fact speculations and that they were meant to try to connect dots and open up places where there are in fact things that we don't know, and instead just became accepted as renderings of particular moments in time, which was not what their original intention was. So their utility as tools disappeared entirely. So and now I'm going to close out the conversation and leave you with that really depressing note. No, I actually am going to stop here, but I want to stop here to say that I think as you begin, I want you to think about making choices about representation, and also understand that it is a lot like landscape maintenance. You make these visualizations, they move out into the world, and you are responsible for continuing to keep up with their life as they move into the public sphere. And there are some hard choices there about how you want them to function. And this is something that I continue to wrestle with and would welcome any questions that you have or any thoughts that you have about where that sits for you. So thanks for your time, and I will kick it back to a Q&A.
Thank you, Kristi. Thank you. Thank you for the talk. And I'm going to open things up to questions. You can raise your hand in the participants list, and as usual, I'll kick off with the first question while everyone figures out how to raise their hands or compose the question. I guess one that I would like to, I'd like to go back to, and it's no doubt like a ton of questions that come up now, and that we're going to have to dive into it at another point also. But one of those is one that you brought up about aesthetics and the kind of release of aesthetics by this exploration of the tool or the instrument or the device. And I guess one thing I would love to hear a bit more on your end is I'm not sure if I 100% believe you about this idea of like kind of releasing of the aesthetic. And a lot of the work that you've done, I think it pushes back on the kind of modernist notion of kind of the landscape as some form of composition of form, and particularly how that responds to an environment that's always changing at multiple timescales. And I think my work, your work, other people in this lecture today, we've essentially over time borrowed an aesthetic from the post-industrial or the infrastructural, and a lot of this kind of pervades what we the way we portray our work. But I guess like looking forward, one of the things that I'm extremely interested in is what is this kind of aesthetic of the curated or the choreographed, particularly when we're starting to talk about the design of tools and devices that begin to kind of re-represent through kind of co-production and kind of other forms of interaction with the environment. And so I think, I don't know if in that, like you see an aesthetic that kind of starts to form in that realm that is, it's less about the single author, but it is one that still drives design and design culture. Does that sit within the way you're seeing kind of representation and the kind of built landscape?
Yeah, it does. Anna, I try to be, y'all don't know me, but I've tried to be kind of honest about where vulnerabilities are in my relationship with this question. Maybe as a coda to that, I would say that I had a few slides in there that were about the kind of aesthetic range of my work. It looked so cacophonous that it was really hard for me to imagine showing that to a group of people who haven't seen my work before and then make any sense of it.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's an aesthetic choice, right?
Yep.
And so I showed projects that maybe flow together a little bit more. I also am really fascinated with what engineering and infrastructure were doing between 1930 and 1950.
Mm-hmm.
And that lives personally for me in a very obsessive aesthetic obsession. No question about that. With this last series of drawings that I showed about the Colosseum, I've never really been interested in realism or hyperrealism before, but the choice to go that direction was in part to pull aesthetics out of the discussion for two reasons. One was that any aesthetic that I kind of road tested in the early phases of this immediately attached the drawing to a time period rather than the conditions that were being surfaced in the image. The other part of that was about the people that we were designing the tool for. The scholars that we were bringing together to discuss this work needed to be able to immediately step in and be implicated in its potential realness. And the only way that I was able to figure out how to do that was to essentially make it look as much like a photograph as possible. So people felt like Susan Sontag would probably be really upset with me for doing this. It felt like the right thing to do in order to get more quickly to a conversation about whether or not that was possible.
That's great. Thanks for that. We have a couple questions. Robin?
Hey, Robin.
Hi, Kristi. Well, having followed your work for a long time, I wanted to just either make it easier for you to deal with representation or more difficult. Okay. Because it's a word I've been interested in for quite a while, and among the many etymological roots of it is to make present. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is one of the more intriguing ways to think about it, because it is not, unfortunately, the word has been taken over by art history to sort of talk about, exactitude and semblance and those kind of things, when in fact it is an active proposition that is almost very difficult to separate from design itself. And so you have this other word, invention, which really means to come upon. And you have these things that to make present, it has to have been there in some way, or has it? To invent is not sort of novelty or something like that. It's seeing something that has always been there in a very different set of relations. And so to me, the active aspect of representation, which to me overlays with design and invention, would be a way to expand the whole process of seeing the world into the actual design project itself, the artifact itself. And so to me, that's another way to think about how you might imagine your flawed memory, which I sort of view as kind of dealing with abstraction, another word that's been poorly understood and used, which is that notion of kind of literally drawing away from something so that its particularities fade and its more general relations start to be possible. So I mean, it seems that dealing with these various terms you're setting up is why I find your representation so fascinating.
Thank you. We don't need more terms to toss into the mix, but I'm going to add one more, and that's accuracy. I spoke a little bit about it at the beginning, but accuracy is a word that I feel like I've similarly struggled with. And I know, Brad, you and I have talked about this over the years, certainly spent many hours talking about it with Matthew Seibert, in the context of some collaborations we've done. But it was a big moment for me when I realized that the design projects that I'm involved with very rarely hinge on accuracy. Very rarely is accuracy a valuable ingredient in what that design project is about. Okay, I don't do precision welding. I am not going out and doing precision grading. And so freeing myself up from that was a big kind of moment of revelation in the making process, and one that's really, really hard to let go of. Well, hard for me, less hard for people like Matthew, who I think kind of wandered into that with no problem. But I think that that added an experimental quality to the process of making, which for me gets one step closer to thinking about making as a kind of experimental instrumentation process.
Not to dominate, just one last comment. What would you think? I agree with you on accuracy. It's something to avoid. However, I am a substantial advocate of precision.
Yeah.
Because I think one can have precise inaccuracy or precisely flawed memory as an incredibly valuable way to see things and act on things.
I totally agree.
Cool.
Thank you. Cody Young, did you have a question?
Yeah, I do. First of all, thank you so much for talking. I really appreciated listening. So I just want to talk about a little bit about the collective aesthetic. When you were talking about kind of dropping the aesthetic and focusing a little bit more on using technology as a tool, I was just kind of thinking about how this aesthetic that we as designers would be using collectively would kind of form back that normal aesthetic that your teacher warned against, and but maybe in a new way of how could you kind of utilize the dissociative visualization that it looked like you did with drawing in like tools. It's something I'm using now, which is new to me, and I like the idea of it looked like maybe watercolor, what you were doing with your drawings. I'm trying to like kind of break free with the tools to kind of I mean, I guess not necessarily be as accurate as as the main goal, but more expressive. And I was just wondering if you had any notes on that.
Sure. I very much appreciate the question, and I think it's something that requires a kind of discipline. It's very easy to become comfortable in aligning yourself or pledging allegiance to certain tools. And you saw a lot of pencil drawings, right? I clearly have an allegiance to the pencil, a very specific pencil that I work really hard to find everywhere I go in the world. And the reason for that is primarily because of the sort of ease of access. I can pull it out at any time and just keep drawing. Separate of my feelings about the pencil, I think I've worked pretty hard to turn away anytime I feel like, ooh, this program has tons of answers for me, or this is the way I like to make drawings now, and this is the sort of steps that I like to go through or the kind of sequencing of analog to digital work. I like to try and, I found that it's productive for me to keep flipping that on its head as often as possible. And instead to sort of adopt a kind of, I mean, I'm the last person in the world that could be confused with a hacker, but like a hacker's mentality that if you give me anything, I can get drawings out of it, right? Or I can make models out of it. I don't care. And I have a kind of equal love for all things in terms of their ability to help me produce, help me make something. And so I think that keeps me from saying I need to have these programs available to me, or I'm not interested in learning that new software because I only want to work. I've already figured out how to make a drawing in this direction.
Thank you. And kind of a follow-up question to that would be, in the consistent reinventing of your style, it might seem cumbersome to archive all of the different variances of work, if it's digital or drawings. How do you, combine everything into one usable space? It seems like that would add up pretty quickly if you're consistently finding new ways to model.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely does, but I feel like that's the really luxurious detritus that we get to be a part of, because you never know when that stuff kind of comes back around and is useful again. I try to, with my students, cultivate a fairly transparent relationship about how work gets made, so that it kind of demystifies the process and takes away the notion that expertise is what we're going for in any one mode of representation, or any one like media technique. So I have quite a bank of lectures about the kind of construction of drawings and the misfires on drawings. And I think my students tend to appreciate seeing that side of the design process, but that's also super useful for me to go back when I'm talking to our Media 1 students and go back through my own process and say, oh yes, this is where decisions started to happen, and I need to get back to thinking about those critical moments.
Thank you, Kristi.
Excellent. Thank you. Do we have other questions this evening for Kristi? You can just turn your microphone, unmute it, shout it out. No? Sarah.
Hey, Kristi.
Oh, hi.
Hey, I wanted to ask you about something you said at the end of your talk, which is about being responsible for the life of a work kind of after you release it into the world. And I thought that was a really interesting idea. Like in the art world, there have been so many, the artist's intention is often completely different from how a work is interpreted by an audience. And similarly, that I'm interested in interpretive design. And in interpretive design, folks are kind of trying to get away from guiding sort of singular reads of landscapes. So I guess I am really curious if you're talking about if that statement sort of applies just to representations, or could this also extend to landscapes? Do we really have control over how an audience kind of interprets our works in whatever form they might take? It's very broad, but just curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, this is something new that I'm thinking about, and I finally reached a point. Took a while for my stuff to live out in the world where it sort of moved around enough that I could, it was far enough away from my reach that it could start to be something different. And so I feel like I'm sort of just getting into what this means. And I don't build landscapes and I don't build architectures. So it's I have to sort of speak from where I sit and the things that I make. But I think we've all kind of traded notes about how it feels to submit for a competition jury and it goes into the black hole and it just gets eaten up by the abyss, right? But it doesn't really, and it does live out there in some way. And so what kind of responsibility do we have for those moments of trying to provoke or trying to move forward an agenda that feels right in that moment, but might not have the kind of staying power? And I think the closest that I've come to trying to, situate it for myself is to think about it in terms of landscape maintenance, which I think was a kind of quick comment I made. But to think about setting up a project in terms of kind of checking back in with it. Not all projects need the same level of care moving forward, but those ones that do have an agenda that's meant to ask provocative questions of an audience, or were designed to provoke disputes among, like the Colosseum drawings have things that are meant to make scholars of different disciplines disagree. And that was part of its job as a tool. So for that to go out as a representation, like a decided truth of what the Colosseum was like in 1642 is problematic, right? And how do you then walk that back? That part I'm not so clear on, because I didn't see that coming until it was already well out in the world. So let's keep talking about that one. I don't know if I have any more resolution to your question than just I'm beginning to work on it, and I'm real concerned about it.
All right, last chance, everyone. Any other questions for Kristi? A couple more minutes, maybe. Okay. Kristi, thank you so much. It's always good to see you. Always good to hear you talk about your work. And thank you for taking the time to answer some questions at the end.
Yeah, cheers. Thank you. It's great to see everybody. And I appreciate the chance to share the work, and please reach out anytime if questions come up after the fact.
All right. Thanks so much. Have a good night. Bye.
Ursula, hi, Brew. Hi.